The Arizona sun was a hammer, and the dust was the anvil. For 3 days, Eliza Jane Whitlow had felt herself being beaten into a new shape by the heat and the grit. Red dust, the color of a fresh wound, worked its way into the seams of her traveling dress, into the pores of her skin, into the very back of her throat. It was the only currency of the landscape, a fine powder that coated the sagebrush, the skeletal ribs of saguaro, and the dispositions of the 4 souls rattling inside the overland stagecoach. Eliza kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, a shimmering line where the impossible blue of the sky met the burnt orange of the earth. She was 26 years old, and she had come to Silvervale to disappear, or rather, to become someone else. A seamstress, a bookkeeper, a woman with no past worth mentioning. From a place, Kansas, that was now nothing more than a ghost on her tongue. It was a simple, sturdy ambition, like a line of plain stitches. She had her skills, a letter of introduction for a position at Prosper's Dry Goods, and a small valise containing everything she owned in the world. Well, almost everything. Her right hand rested in her lap, fingers still, but her mind was on the secret weight sewn into the heavy lining of her petticoats. A cloth-bound ledger, its pages filled not with sums and credits, but with the quiet arithmetic of ruin, names, dates, and payments that could unravel a conspiracy of greed that had already left good people dead. That ledger was the reason she had fled Dodge City in the dead of night. It was the reason she now sat bolt upright, feigning a calm she had not felt in months. The man beside her, a drummer for a patent medicine company, had long ago surrendered to the jolting rhythm of the coach, his head lolling with each rut in the road. Across from her, a young woman with weary eyes held a sleeping toddler, her posture a study in maternal exhaustion. The child's soft breaths were the only gentle sound in a world of creaking leather and groaning wood. The road, if one could call it that, was a pair of faint tracks carved through a wilderness of rock and thorn. They were passing through a canyon now, the walls rising on either side like silent, watching giants painted in strokes of ochre, violet, and blood red. The air grew still, the oppressive heat trapped between the stone faces, the driver's cheerful whistling, a sound that had been a comfort for the past 50 miles, suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. Then came a shout from up top, sharp with alarm, followed by the grinding protest of the brake. The coach lurched to a violent halt, throwing the sleeping drummer against Eliza. The toddler woke with a startled cry. What in thunderation, the drummer sputtered, pushing himself upright. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She peered through the dusty window. Riders, 5 of them, materializing from the heat haze and the shadows of the rocks. They were hard men on wiry horses, their faces obscured by trail dust and grim purpose. They did not look like common highwaymen. There was a discipline to their formation, a cold intent in the way they held their rifles. One man, clearly the leader, urged his horse forward. He was tall in the saddle, with a lean, predatory stillness. "Everybody out," he called, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Nice and easy. The driver, a grizzled man named Jeb, climbed down with his hands raised. His shotgun lay uselessly on the seat beside him. The door was pulled open, and the passengers stumbled out into the blinding sun, blinking like creatures drawn from a cave. The heat was a physical blow. Eliza's first thought was of the ledger. Her blood ran cold. She forced her legs to move, to carry her out onto the red earth, her hands held slightly away from her body. She stood between the drummer and the young mother, who clutched her child tightly. "Wallets, watches," the leader said, dismounting. His spurs chimed a cruel little song on the hard-packed ground. "Jewelry. Put it all in the sack." One of his men moved along the small line of passengers with a burlap sack. The drummer dropped his wallet in with a sigh. The young mother, trembling, removed a simple gold band from her finger. When the man reached Eliza, She untied the ribbon of her reticule and let the small purse, containing a few carefully saved dollars, fall into the bag. But the leader, a man she would later learn was called Bo Kincaid, was not watching the collection. His eyes, pale and cold as a winter sky, were fixed on Eliza. He walked past the others, his boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped directly in front of her. He was close enough that she could smell the sour scent of sweat, leather, and something else, something like cold iron. The trunk, he said, his voice low, meant only for her, the one with the initials EJW. A chill, profound and terrifying, washed over Eliza, colder than any desert night. This was not random. This was not a robbery. This was an assassination of her future. They knew who she was. They knew what she might have. "I do not know what you mean," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She had rehearsed 1,000 different kinds of courage in her mind, and now a thin, brittle version of it came to her aid. Kincaid offered a smile that held no warmth. "Do not play dumb with me. Ma'am, my employer is a man of specific tastes. He does not like loose ends." He gestured to 2 of his men. "Get the trunk, break it open." The men holstered their rifles and moved to the back of the stagecoach. They hauled down her modest wooden trunk, its surface scarred from the journey, the neat black letters of her initials stark against the pale pine. They smashed the lock with a pistol butt and began to tear it open, their movements rough and efficient. They were not searching, they were hunting. Eliza watched as her life was turned inside out on the dusty ground. Her 2 spare dresses, a book of poetry, her sewing kit with its neat spools of thread and silver thimble, all were tossed aside with contempt. They ripped the lining, searching for a hidden compartment, their frustration mounting with every empty find. This was the twist she had never anticipated. She had imagined pursuit, perhaps a quiet threat in a dark alley once she was settled. She had not imagined this, a brazen attack in broad daylight, a public declaration that she was a marked woman. The other passengers stared, their own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this strange, targeted violation. Kincaid's cold eyes never left hers. "It is not in there," he said, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "Where is it?" Eliza's mind raced. The ledger felt like a block of hot lead against her thigh. If she ran, they would shoot her down. If she surrendered it, her life was forfeit anyway. Silas Crow was not a man who left witnesses. Just as Kincaid took a step toward her, a strange thing happened. A gust of wind, sudden and powerful, swirled down the canyon. It was not a natural breeze. It felt directed, intelligent. It kicked up the fine red dust, creating a blinding, choking cloud that enveloped the riders. Horses shied, nickering in alarm. Men cursed, shielding their eyes. Through the red haze, a sharp crack echoed from the canyon rim high above them. It was not the heavy boom of a buffalo gun, but the crisp, authoritative report of a Winchester. A puff of dust erupted less than an inch from Kincaid's boot. It was not a miss, it was a message, perfectly delivered. "What in the devil?" Kincaid snarled, peering up into the swirling dust and blinding sun. Another crack, and a canteen was shot clean off the saddle of one of the riders' horses, spraying water in a glistening arc before thudding to the ground. The message was now an ultimatum. Eliza squinted, her eyes watering from the dust, and saw him, a figure, standing on a high ledge, silhouetted against the brilliant sky. He was as still as the ancient rock he stood upon, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He was too far away to make out his features, but his presence was immense, a silent, commanding force that seemed to emanate from the very land itself. A Navajo. She guessed from his bearing and his seamless connection to the earth. He had used the canyon's fickle winds as a weapon, the dust as a shield. Kincaid and his crow's foot riders were creatures of the saloon and the dusty street. This high desert was not their element. They were exposed, outmaneuvered by a ghost on a ridge. "Let's go," Kincaid yelled, his composure finally breaking. "It is not worth this. His men scrambled for their horses, eager to be gone. They mounted and spurred their animals, galloping back the way they had come, swallowed by the red dust they had stirred. Kincaid was the last to leave. He threw one last look of pure venom toward Eliza, then a frustrated, hateful glare up at the silent figure on the ledge, before wheeling his horse and vanishing. The dust began to settle. The world slowly came back into focus. The driver, Jeb, let out a long, shaky breath. "Well, I'll be whoever you are up there." "Much obliged," he yelled toward the rim. There was no answer. When Eliza looked again, the figure was gone. He had melted back into the rock and the light, as if he had never been there at all. The rest of the journey into Silver Vale was a tense, silent affair. The other passengers gave Eliza a wide berth, their gazes a mixture of pity and suspicion. Trouble had a smell, and right now, she was drenched in it. She repacked her trunk with trembling hands, her meager possessions feeling fragile and foolish after their violent exposure. She stitched the lining closed, her needle moving with a practiced, steady rhythm that belied the frantic beating of her heart. The ledger was safe. For now. Silver Vale was not a town. It was a wound in the earth that refused to heal. It clung to the side of a mountain that had been stripped and gutted for the silver in its veins. The main street was a river of mud in the wet season and a cauldron of dust in the dry. The buildings were raw timber, slapped together with more speed than care, their false fronts leaning like tired old men. The air hung thick with the smells of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, blasting powder, and the cheap whiskey that fueled the entire enterprise. Eliza stepped down from the coach onto a splintered boardwalk, her valise in hand, and took it all in. This was her sanctuary. This was her new beginning. The thought was so absurd it was almost funny. She found Prosper's dry goods easily enough, a large, respectable-looking establishment with clean windows displaying bolts of calico and sturdy denim. But before she could cross the street, a man stepped into her path. He was a big man, his bulk straining the seams of a tailored but dusty suit. A silver star was pinned to his vest. His face was fleshy and pale, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Miss Eliza Jane Whitlow?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it all the more unsettling. "Yes," Eliza replied, her guard immediately up. "Sheriff Amos Pike," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Silver Vale. We heard the stage had some trouble out on the trail." "Word traveled fast, too fast." "A simple robbery," Eliza said, keeping her voice level. "Nothing was taken." Sheriff Pike's gaze drifted over her, lingering for a moment on her travel-stained dress and the trunk Jeb was now unloading. "Is that so? Well, I'm glad to hear it. We like to keep things peaceful here in Silver Vale. We are a town of hard workers. Miss Whitlow. We have no room for troublemakers, agitators, or folks who carry their disputes with them from other places." It was not a question. It was a perfectly polished threat. He knew, or he was paid by the man who knew. The web she had tried to escape had been waiting for her all along. "I am a seamstress. Sheriff," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My only dispute is with a poorly cut pattern. I am here to work." He smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "Excellent. I do hope you find your time here quiet and productive." He tipped his hat again and walked away, his presence lingering in the air like the smell of stale cigar smoke, feeling as though she had just walked a tightrope over a canyon. Eliza made her way to the Mesquite House, the boarding establishment recommended in her letter. It was a clean, two-story building run by a widow named Martha Doyle, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and kind, observant eyes, after securing a small, clean room under the eaves. Eliza went down to the common room for the evening meal. The room was filled with the low hum of conversation from the other boarders, mostly miners and merchants. Eliza sat alone at a small table, nursing a cup of weak coffee, content to be invisible for a while. But the conversation from a nearby table snagged her attention. "Silas Crow is going to do it this time? I tell you," a man with a thick beard was saying. "He's got the investors, got the equipment. That damned Coyote Wash will be up before the first snow." "About time," another man grumbled. "That creek runs dry half the summer. We need a steady supply for the sluice boxes. More water means more silver." "What about the Navajo?" a younger man asked. "I hear they call that wash sacred ground. Say the water is the lifeblood of their valley." The bearded man snorted in derision. "They can find another valley. Progress has a price. Silas Crow knows how to pay it. He will make this whole territory rich." Eliza froze, a piece of cornbread halfway to her lips. Coyote Wash. The name resonated in her memory. A fragment from a map she had studied back in Kansas. A map showing tribal lands and the dam. A project of Silas Crow, the very man whose name was written again and again in her hidden ledger, next to sums of money paid for services rendered by Bo Kincaid and the Crow's Foot Riders. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a cell door locking. The attack on the stagecoach was not just about the ledger's past. It was about its future. Silas Crow was silencing a threat to his new enterprise. And the man on the ridge, the silent Navajo warrior who had appeared and disappeared like a desert spirit, was not just a random savior. He was a guardian. He was protecting his home, his water, his people, from the same man who wanted Eliza silenced. She had not come to Silver Vale to find a quiet life. She had stumbled into the heart of a war over water, which in this dry and thirsty land was a war over life itself. The red dust on her dress suddenly felt heavier, no longer a simple nuisance of travel, but a stain, a symbol of the secrets and the blood that watered the ground in this hard, unforgiving place. She was not on the sidelines. She was the storm's center. Prosper's Dry Goods was an island of order in the chaotic sea of Silver Vale. Its clean plank floors smelled of sawdust, coffee beans, and new cotton. Bolts of fabric stood in neat rows like soldiers awaiting inspection, their colors a vibrant rebellion against the monochrome dust outside. Eliza found a strange peace in the work. By day, her world shrank to the precise geometry of a pattern, the steady rhythm of a treadle sewing machine, and the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly turned seam. She measured ranchers for durable denim trousers, fitted miners' wives for Sunday calico dresses, and listened. She learned the town's rhythms through the snippets of gossip and complaint that passed over the countertop. At night, her duties shifted. In the small office at the back of the store, surrounded by the scent of ink and paper, she took up Mr. Prosper's ledgers. He was a kind, flustered man, more comfortable with a yardstick than a pen, and his books were a tangled wilderness of hasty scribbles and forgotten transactions. Eliza's mind, sharp and orderly, found pleasure in bringing them to heel. She untangled the knots of credit, balanced the columns of figures, and transformed his chaos into clean, elegant script. This was her public ledger, a testament to her value, her reason for being in Silver Vale. But later, in the quiet solitude of her room at the Mesquite House, she would begin her real work by the flickering light of a single tallow lamp, with the door bolted and a blanket stuffed against the crack at the bottom. She would retrieve the cloth-bound ledger from its hiding place. She had bought a new account book at Prosper's, identical to the original, and with a pen dipped in watered-down ink, she began the painstaking task of copying Silas Crow's secrets. Each night was a trial of nerves. The old boarding house groaned and settled around her, every creak of the floorboards in the hall outside sending a jolt of ice through her veins. Martha Doyle, her landlady, was a decent woman, her footsteps a familiar, heavy tread. But other boarders kept late hours, their drunken laughter a coarse counterpoint to the scratching of Eliza's pen. She worked with a slow, deliberate hand, her seamstress's eye for detail ensuring that every number, every name, was a perfect replica. This copy was her only insurance. If they came for the original, she would have another arrow in her quiver. The needle and thread had taught her the wisdom of having a backup, a second seam to hold things together if the first one tore. Some days, to escape the suffocating confines of the town, she would take long walks into the high desert that surrounded it. She told Martha she was searching for plants to make dyes, a plausible excuse that gave her a reason to carry a basket and wander the arid hills. It was on one of these excursions, in a narrow pass bristling with the sharp, blue-green spears of agave plants, that she saw him again. He did not emerge or appear. He was simply there, standing by a weathered outcrop of rock, as if he had been part of the landscape all along. It was the man from the canyon rim, Hashke Yazi. He was not wearing the buckskins of a warrior, but the simple, durable trousers and dark shirt of a man who worked the land. He held no rifle, yet he seemed no less formidable. His stillness was a force in itself, his dark eyes taking in everything without seeming to move. Eliza's heart gave a familiar, frightened leap, but she did not run. She owed this man her life, or at the very least, her possessions. She gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement. He inclined his head in return, his expression unreadable. "The plants are not afraid of you," he said. His voice was low and quiet, like the sound of wind moving through a cave. It held no accent she could place, only a careful, deliberate cadence. Eliza looked down at her basket, which was empty. "I am not a very good forager. It seems—" "You are not looking for plants," he stated. It was not an accusation, just a fact. "You are looking for a way out." She looked up, startled by his directness. "I have only just arrived." "Some people arrive already looking for the door," he countered. He took a step closer, not menacingly, but with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing. "The men who stopped the stagecoach, they work for Silas Crow." Again, a simple statement of fact. Eliza's throat went dry. "I do not know that name." The lie was thin and brittle, and she felt foolish saying it. He did not call her on it. Instead, his gaze moved past her, toward the distant gash in the mountains where the work on the dam had begun. "He is building a wall to stop the water at Coyote Wash. He tells the town it will bring them wealth. He does not tell them that when you choke a river, the land dies, the cottonwoods, the grasses your cattle eat, the small springs, everything." His eyes returned to hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond stoicism. It was a deep, unyielding sorrow. "My people call the water Nealon. It is life, not just for us, for you, for everyone. A dam does not make life. It takes it." She saw the truth of his words, felt the weight of them. He was not just a protector of his own land. He saw the entire ecosystem, the delicate web of existence that Silas Crow was preparing to tear apart for profit. The urge to trust him, to tell him about the ledger that proved his words, was a physical thing, a pressure building in her chest. But fear was an older, more powerful habit. "You always appear at the right moment," she said, her voice a little shaky, like a wind that knows the way. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "The wind only goes where it must," he replied. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent communication passing between them that was deeper than words. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing among the rocks and the long afternoon shadows. Eliza returned to town feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her secret was no longer hers alone. It was connected to this silent man and his fight to protect the water. The thought was both terrifying and, strangely, a relief. She was not entirely alone. The next day, a new presence made itself felt in the town's moral landscape. Padre Reuben, the Catholic priest from the small adobe mission at the edge of town, came into the store. He was a small, wiry man with skin the color of tanned leather and eyes that seemed to hold a gentle, weary wisdom. He needed black thread to mend his cassock, and he and Eliza fell into easy conversation as she measured it out. He spoke of the families in the poorer quarter of town, of the sickness that came with the bad water in the late summer, of the hope and the desperation that lived side by side in Silver Vale. He did not speak of Silas Crow or the dam, but as he left, he paused at the door. "You have good hands, my child," he said, looking at her. "Steady. They can be used to build beautiful things or to mend what is broken." He gave her a small, sad smile and was gone. Eliza felt as though he had looked straight through her dress, her skin, and seen the ledger sewn into her petticoats. The sense of being watched, of moving through a world of hidden meanings, was becoming her constant companion. It came to a head 2 days later. It was late afternoon, and the store was empty save for Eliza and Mr. Prosper, who was counting out a shipment of new axe handles. The bell over the door jingled, and Sheriff Amos Pike filled the doorway. The air in the shop instantly grew thick and still. Mr. Prosper, who was generally cheerful, suddenly looked nervous, his hands fumbling with the handles. "Afternoon, Prosper," Pike said, his eyes scanning the store before landing on Eliza. He ignored Mr. Prosper completely. "Miss Whitlow, just the person I was looking for." He ambled over to the counter, his boots making heavy, deliberate sounds on the floorboards. He removed his hat and placed it on the counter, a proprietary gesture. "Sheriff," Eliza said, her voice cool. She kept her hands busy, folding a length of gingham. "Just making my rounds," he said smoothly. "Town ordinance. We have to keep a record of all new residents, for their own protection. You understand, I need to see your residency papers." Eliza's mind went blank. Residency papers? There was no such thing. It was a complete fabrication, a tool of intimidation designed for this very moment. "I am afraid I do not have any such papers," she said. "I was not aware they were required." "Oh, they are required," Pike said, his voice hardening just enough to reveal the steel beneath the velvet. "A formality, of course, but an important one. We cannot have folks just drifting in and out, can we? We need to know who people are, where they come from, what business they have here." "My business is with Mr. Prosper," Eliza said, her chin lifting a fraction. "I am his bookkeeper and seamstress." "Is that right?" Prosper Pike asked, turning his head slowly toward the store's owner. "Yes, Sheriff, that is correct." "Mr. Prosper stammered, dropping an axe handle with a loud clatter. "She is a fine worker, the best I have ever had." Pike turned back to Eliza, a smug look on his face. "Well then, I am sure it is just an oversight. You will want to get that sorted out right away. Go see the clerk at the assayer's office. He will get you the proper forms. I will check back in a few days to make sure everything is in order." He picked up his hat, settling it on his head. "We would not want any complications with your continued employment." He gave her one last, pointed look, then turned and walked out, the bell over the door sounding a final, mocking little jingle. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken threats. "Mr. Prosper hurried over, his face pale with sweat. "I am so sorry, Miss Whitlow," he whispered. "There are no residency papers. He does that sometimes, when Crow wants someone to feel unwelcome." Eliza nodded, her hands now tightly gripping the edge of the wooden counter. "I understand, Mr. Prosper. You do not need to worry." But she was worried. The net was tightening. Pike's visit was a clear message from Silas Crow. "I see you. I am watching you. I can crush you whenever I choose." Her quiet, anonymous life was a fiction. She was a secret, and secrets in a town this small had a way of getting loud. That night, she did not take out the copybook. She sat by her window, looking out at the cold, star-drenched desert, the vast, silent land that stretched out beyond the dirty, grasping little town. She thought of Hashke Yazi, a man who seemed to be a part of that land, a man who fought for the lifeblood that flowed through it. She thought of her ledger, the poison and the cure, hidden in the dark. To remain silent was to be a coward, to let Crow win, to let him destroy the land and the people who depended on it, but to speak out, to use the weapon she held, was to invite the violence that had chased her all the way from Kansas. Her internal conflict was a palpable thing, a knot of fear and duty. For the first time, she truly understood what Hashke had meant. The wind only goes where it must. And she had the growing, terrifying feeling that she was being blown toward a confrontation she could not avoid. The only question left was whether she would face it alone. The news came on the wind, a rumor that solidified into hard fact by midday. Silas Crow was planning a test blast at the dam site, a demonstration of power. The talk in the store went, to impress a visiting investor from Tucson, to Eliza. The words were a death knell. A test blast meant explosives, and explosives in the hands of Crow's men meant danger far beyond the rock they intended to break. She was sweeping the floor of Prosper's, the rhythmic whisk of the broom a poor substitute for calm, when a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Hashke. He stood just outside, a silent summons. Eliza set the broom aside, murmured an excuse to Mr. Prosper about needing air, and stepped out into the harsh afternoon light. "They are moving the dynamite tonight," Hashke said without preamble, his voice low. "They will set the charges for the blast at dawn." "What can we do?" Eliza asked, her own voice a whisper. "They store the crates in a small cave near the blasting site. There are markings on them, shipping logs that prove where they came from, who paid for them. Your man, Crow." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "You can draw. I have seen the sketches in your basket when you walk in the hills." Eliza was taken aback. She had thought her doodling of desert flowers and rock formations was a private thing. "I can," she confirmed. "I need you to draw the markings on those crates, exactly as you see them. It will be proof that he is using blasting powder far in excess of what is legal. Enough to cause a catastrophe. Not just a demonstration." The request was insane. It meant sneaking into the heart of her enemy's operation. Yet she did not hesitate. The time for hiding was over. "When do we leave?" "At moonrise. Meet me at the edge of town, by the old cottonwood." That night, Eliza dressed not as a seamstress, but as a shadow. She wore a dark riding skirt and a sturdy blouse, her hair braided tightly, in a small leather satchel. She packed a charcoal pencil, a small sketchbook, and a spool of heavy linen thread, the kind used for mending saddles. It was immensely strong, a practical tool she never went without. She told a curious Martha Doyle she was going to sit with the Padre's sister, who had taken ill, a lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. Hashke was waiting for her, 2 horses blending into the deep shadows of the cottonwood. He gave her the reins of a steady-looking mare without a word, and mounted his own pony. They rode out of Silvervale, leaving the flickering yellow lights and the drunken shouts of the saloons behind them, and entered a world of silver and black. The desert at night was another country entirely. The familiar landscape was transformed into a place of stark, alien beauty. They rode across a vast salt flat that crunched under the horses' hooves, the ground glowing with an eerie white light under the moon. Skeletal Ocotillo reached toward the sky like desperate arms, and the saguaros stood as silent, looming sentinels. A wind had picked up, a dry, restless Santa Ana that moaned through the canyons and carried the chill of the high peaks. It whipped at Eliza's clothes and stung her cheeks, a constant, whining complaint against their intrusion. Hashke led them on a winding path, through dry washes and up rocky inclines. His knowledge of the terrain absolute. He was a part of this land. And with him, Eliza felt not like a trespasser but a privileged guest. He pointed out a trail of coyote tracks, the silent flight of a great horned owl, small things that made the vast emptiness feel alive. After nearly 2 hours, he reined in his horse at the mouth of a narrow box canyon. "We walk from here," he murmured, swinging down from his saddle. "The cave is just ahead." They tethered the horses in a thicket of mesquite and proceeded on foot. The air grew colder, the wind sharpening its teeth as it funneled between the rock walls. They moved slowly, carefully, their footsteps muffled by the sandy ground. Hashke put a hand on her arm, bringing her to a halt behind a large boulder. Ahead, a single lantern cast a wavering circle of light on a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall. Two of Crow's men sat by a small fire, their rifles leaning against the rock beside them. Hashke watched them for a long, silent moment. "They will sleep soon," he whispered, his breath a small cloud in the frigid air. They waited. The wind howled a lonely song, and the fire popped and hissed. Eliza's muscles ached with the cold and the tension. Finally, one of the guards kicked dirt onto the fire, plunging the area into near darkness, and the two men rolled up in their blankets near the cave entrance. Hashke gave it another 10 minutes, then touched Eliza's elbow. They moved like ghosts, their feet making no sound. They slipped past the sleeping guards and into the utter blackness of the cave. Hashke struck a match, the sudden flare blindingly bright, and lit a small, shielded candle he produced from his pocket. The cave was small, little more than an overhang, but it was stacked high with wooden crates. The acrid smell of chemicals and sawdust filled the small space. Stenciled on the side of each crate were numbers and symbols, and a name, Red Rock Mining Consortium. Silas Crow, proprietor. "Here," Hashke said, holding the candle steady. Eliza pulled out her sketchbook and pencil. Her fingers were numb with cold, but she worked quickly, her mind focused, the familiar motions of drawing a comfort in the terrifying situation. She copied the stencils, the shipping marks, the manufacturer's emblem from a company in New Mexico. She filled 2 pages with the detailed sketches, her charcoal moving with a speed and precision born of adrenaline. As she finished the last drawing, Hashke, who had been examining the equipment at the back of the cave, made a low, guttural sound. He held up a small object for her to see in the candlelight. It was a blasting cap, a small copper cylinder with 2 wires trailing from it. "Look," he said, his voice tight with a new, more urgent dread. He pointed to a small pile of them on a wooden board. The wires had been connected to a timing mechanism, but they were crudely, almost carelessly, attached. "This is wrong. All wrong." "What is it?" Eliza asked. "The detonator assembly. It is unstable. A charge this large, with caps this poorly set, the blast will not be contained. It will not just break rock. It will cause a landslide. It is aimed directly at the narrowest part of the valley." His eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw a cold, terrible understanding. "There is a dine encampment just below. Families. They will be buried." A new layer of evil settled over the scene. This was not just about clearing rock. It was about clearing people. But before the horror could fully register, a shadow fell across the cave mouth. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." The voice was flat and cold. Bo Kincaid stood there, a revolver in his hand, a cruel smile playing on his lips. The 2 guards were behind him, now awake and holding rifles. They were trapped. "We were just admiring Mr. Crow's handiwork," Hashke said, his body subtly shifting to place himself between Eliza and Kincaid. The candle flame danced, casting long, monstrous shadows on the cave walls. "He is going to be mighty interested to hear about his 2 newest admirers," Kincaid sneered. "Get their hands tied." But as the guards moved forward, Hashke acted in one fluid motion. He kicked the board holding the blasting caps. It flew into the air, and he simultaneously threw the candle at a crate of what looked like oil-soaked rags. The cave erupted in a flash of light and thick, choking smoke. In the confusion, Hashke grabbed Eliza's arm and pulled her toward the back of the cave. She had noticed a small fissure in the rock earlier, a dark crack barely wide enough for a person. He shoved her toward it. "Go!" She scrambled through the narrow opening, the rock scraping her clothes, and tumbled out onto a ledge on the other side of the rock face. A moment later, Hashke was beside her. Below them, shouting and cursing echoed from the smoke-filled cave. The horses Hashke yelled over the wind. They ran, stumbling over the loose scree, their lungs burning. They reached the mesquite thicket, untied the reins with frantic fingers, and swung into their saddles. They spurred the horses, galloping out of the box canyon and onto the open hills. They were not safe for long. A shot rang out, and a bullet whined past Eliza's ear. Kincaid and his men were mounted, chasing them. A lantern held by one of the riders bobbed in the darkness, a single, malevolent eye hunting them through the night. The chase was a nightmare of pounding hooves and screaming wind. They raced over hills covered in a strange, pale grass that glittered like snow in the moonlight. Hashke led them on a desperate, weaving path, using the terrain to their advantage. But Kincaid's men were gaining. Hashke pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "Keep riding," he shouted to Eliza. He reined his horse in sharply. Turning in the saddle, he raised the rifle. A single, deliberate shot cracking through the night. The lantern exploded in a shower of sparks and glass, plunging the entire hillside into absolute darkness. Yells of confusion and anger rose from their pursuers. Eliza risked a glance back and saw only blackness, but the sudden dark was a treacherous gift. Her mare stumbled, and she fought to stay in the saddle. She could hear Hashke's horse nearby, its breath coming in ragged bursts. They were near the edge of a steep drop-off, a place where the earth simply fell away into a deep, black ravine. In the disorienting dark, Hashke's horse, shying from a dislodged rock, lost its footing on the loose shale at the precipice. The animal screamed, scrambling for purchase, its front legs slipping over the edge. Hashke was thrown from the saddle, his body sliding with the crumbling earth, his hands scrabbling for a hold. Hashke Eliza screamed. She wheeled her mare around, her heart seizing with terror. She could just make out his form, a dark shape dangling over the abyss, one hand desperately gripping a tough, exposed root. There was no time to think. She acted on pure instinct, reaching into her satchel. Her fingers closed around the spool of heavy linen thread. It was a foolish, desperate idea, a thread against a man's life, but it was all she had. She kicked her feet free of the stirrups, braced herself against the saddle horn, and threw the spool with all her might. "Catch it!" she yelled, her voice raw. The spool sailed through the air, unwinding as it went. Hashke's free hand shot out and caught it. He wrapped the strong cord around his wrist again and again. "The saddle horn," he shouted, his voice strained with the enormous effort of holding on. "Tie it." Eliza's hands worked frantically, her seamstress's skill finding its ultimate purpose. She pulled the cord taut and, with a series of quick, strong knots she could tie in her sleep, she secured it to the thick leather of the saddle horn. The mare, a good, steady horse, sensed the tension and dug its hooves in, leaning back against the strain. The cord went taut, a thin, humming line connecting the life of the man to the strength of the horse, with her as the anchor. It was an impossible, fragile bridge over nothingness. "Pull," Hashke grunted. Eliza grabbed the reins and urged the mare backward, step by agonizing step. The cord bit into the leather, groaning under the weight. Eliza could feel the strain in her own body, her muscles screaming in sympathy. The horse grunted, pulling, its strength a miracle. Slowly, agonizingly, Hashke's head and shoulders appeared over the edge of the cliff. He clawed his way back onto solid ground, collapsing onto the shale, his chest heaving. She slid from the saddle and rushed to his side, untying the cord from his raw, bleeding wrist. For a long moment, they simply knelt there in the biting wind, the sound of their own ragged breathing mingling with the howl of the Santa Ana. Their pursuers, lost in the darkness, were forgotten. He looked at her, his face pale in the moonlight. He touched the linen cord, still wrapped around his wrist. "Your thread," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It is stronger than it looks," she managed to say. He looked from the cord to her, and his eyes held a new light, a mixture of awe and a deep, profound gratitude that went beyond words. Trust was not a thing you gave. It was a thing you built, stitch by stitch, action by action, Tonight, with a simple spool of thread, she had sewn their fates together. As they caught their breath, the full, terrible meaning of what they had found in the cave returned. "The blasting caps," Eliza said, "the landslide." Hashke nodded, his face grim as he got to his feet. "It was not a mistake. It was a plan. They will set the blast. The mountain will fall, and they will say the Navajo sabotaged the dam." He looked toward the valley where his people were sleeping, unaware. "Crow will not just take the water. He will use it to wash his hands of their blood." They made it back to the outskirts of Silver Vale just as the first pale, bruised light of dawn was staining the eastern sky. They parted without a word, a shared glance of grim understanding passing between them. Eliza slipped back into the mesquite house through a side door, her body aching, her mind a maelstrom of fear and fury. Sleep was an impossibility. By the time she arrived at Prosper's dry goods, the poison was already spreading through the town's bloodstream. The story, a grotesque inversion of the truth, had arrived before her. It started, as most things did in Silver Vale, in the saloons. A crow's foot rider, his arm in a dramatic sling, was buying rounds of whiskey and telling a wild tale of a savage attack at the dam site. "Came at us in the dark," he slurred, his voice carrying through the bat-wing doors and into the street. "A dozen of them, maybe more, screaming like devils, tried to set off the whole powder cache, bring the mountain down on our heads." The lie was potent, perfectly crafted to ignite the town's simmering resentments and fears. It found fertile ground. Eliza heard it whispered over the counter as she sold a spool of thread to a miner's wife. "Did you hear the Navajo tried to blow up the mine works?" the woman said, her eyes wide. "It is a wonder anyone got out alive." "They are getting bolder," her companion added, clutching her market basket. Something has to be done. By mid-morning, the whispers had become a roar. Men gathered in angry knots on the boardwalks, their faces flushed with cheap liquor and righteous indignation. From the window of the shop, Eliza saw Silas Crow step onto the balcony of the Grand Hotel, which he owned. He raised his hands for quiet, a benevolent patriarch calming his flock. "My friends, my neighbors," he called out, his voice rich and persuasive. "We have all heard the terrible news. This was not just an attack on my property. This was an attack on our future, on the prosperity that will make this town a jewel of the Arizona Territory. We cannot allow our progress to be held hostage by fear and violence." He gestured to a man below, who began rolling a barrel of whiskey out onto the street. "Today, the drinks are on the house," Crow declared to a chorus of cheers. "But I ask for something in return. A show of unity, a petition, to be sent to the territorial governor, demanding that the reservation boundaries be enforced and that these violent elements be purged for the safety of our families." The word hung in the air, purged, a clean, sterile word for something ugly and final. A clerk appeared with a long roll of parchment and a pot of ink, and the men, their courage fortified by free whiskey, began to line up to sign their names to the document. Eliza felt a wave of nausea. She was watching a lynching being organized, not with rope, but with ink and alcohol. Her sense of dread deepened when she saw Sheriff Amos Pike stride down the center of the street, flanked by 2 deputies. They were not heading for the saloon. They were heading for the edge of town, where a few Navajo families often camped to trade for supplies. A cold knot formed in Eliza's stomach. A short time later, the grim procession returned. Pike marched 3 young dine men down the main street. They were boys, really none older than 20. Their hands were bound in front of them with iron handcuffs, the metal glinting cruelly in the sun. They looked not guilty or defiant, but utterly bewildered, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. They had likely come to town for flour and salt, and had walked straight into the jaws of a trap. The crowd jeered and shouted insults. A man threw a rotten vegetable that splattered against the back of one of the boys. It was then that the clear, insistent peal of a bell cut through the ugly clamor. Ding, dong, ding, dong. It was the bell from the small adobe mission. Padre Reuben emerged from his church, his black cassock a stark rebuke to the dusty chaos of the street. He walked directly into the path of the sheriff, his small frame holding an unshakable authority. "Sheriff Pike," he said, his voice quiet but carrying. "What is the meaning of this? What have these boys done?" "They are being held for questioning in connection with the sabotage at the dam site." "Padre," Pike replied, his tone one of forced patience. "On what evidence the priest pressed? Were they seen there? Is there a witness who can place them at the scene?" "We have our reasons," Pike said evasively, his eyes shifting away from the priest's steady gaze. "Now, if you will excuse me, this is official town business."
"This is not business. Sheriff, this is an injustice,"
Padre Reuben said, his voice rising with passion.
"You are arresting them because of who they are,
not what they have done. You are feeding this town's fear instead of its reason." Pike took a step closer to the priest, his bulk shadowing the smaller man. "You are a man of God, Padre," he said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "I suggest you stick to your prayers. The business of this town is complicated, full of property disputes and land claims. Your little mission sits on a very interesting parcel. It would be a shame if its charter were to come under review." He smiled thinly. "Now stand aside." Defeated, his face etched with sorrow, Padre Reuben stepped back. Pike and his deputies shoved the young prisoners toward the jail, the heavy oak door closing behind them with a sound of finality. The conscience of Silvervale had spoken, and it had been silenced. Eliza could not stay in the shop. She felt caged, suffocated by the rising tide of hatred. She found Hashke in their prearranged meeting place, a series of crumbling adobe ruins just south of town that offered a clear view of the surrounding hills. He was not looking at the hills. He was staring at the town, his body rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The rage coming off him was a palpable force, a heat that seemed to warp the air around him. "I saw what Pike did," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "It is how it begins," he said, his voice a low growl, like stones grinding together. "First the lie, then the cage, then the gun." She saw something in his eyes then, a darkness that went beyond the immediate injustice, a pain that was old and deep. She knew she could not offer simple comforts. The moment demanded a harder truth. "This is not the first time you have seen this," she said. It was not a question. He remained silent, his jaw tight. "Tell me," she urged, her voice gentle but firm. "Please." He took a long, ragged breath, the sound of a man trying to contain a breaking storm. "I had a brother," he said, his gaze fixed on some distant, terrible point in the past. "His name was Adi. He was younger than me. He had a laugh that could startle birds from the trees." He paused, swallowing hard. "There was a dispute. Some cattle wandered onto a white man's ranch. A mistake. Nothing more, but they called it a raid. A militia was formed. Men like those in the saloon right now, full of whiskey and hate." His voice dropped so low she had to lean in to hear it. "They came at dawn. They called it a pacification. My brother, he was just 14. He was running to bring the horses in. They shot him down. They said he was a threat, a boy with a rope in his hand." He finally turned to look at her, and the raw agony in his eyes was a physical blow. "I see his face in those boys Pike just arrested. I see it every time they look at my people with fear in their eyes." Eliza's heart broke for him, for the boy he had been, for the brother he had lost. She understood now the source of his stillness, his control. It was a dam he had built inside himself to hold back a river of grief and rage. And Silas Crow was trying to break it. She laid a hand on his arm. His muscles were like knotted iron. "They want you to break. Hashke, they want you to ride down there with a gun. They are trying to create the very enemy they have invented." "And what if I do?" he bit out, the control finally cracking. "What if I give them the war they are begging for?" "Then they win," she said simply, her grip tightening. "Then you become the monster they claim you are, and more innocent people will die." She took a breath, steeling herself. The time had come. Her secret was no longer a shield to protect her. It was a weapon they had to use. Silas Crow has done this before. The lies, the violence. It is a pattern. He looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion.
The ledger,
she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper.
The book I carry. It is from Dodge City, from a freight company Crow used to hire. It details his payments. I was a bookkeeper there. I saw too much.
She took another breath, the words feeling heavy and dangerous on her tongue.
There is an entry from 2 years ago. A payment of $5,000 to a group of men, the Crow's Foot Riders. Bo Kincaid's name is right there. The entry is listed as payment for land clearing services.
She let the phrase hang in the air. That land was a Yavapai encampment on the Verde River. A week after that payment was made, the encampment was attacked. The official report called it an unfortunate escalation of a local dispute. But everyone who survived is gone. The land is empty. And now, Silas Crow's cattle graze there. Hashke stared at her, his rage slowly being replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The pieces were connecting, forming a map of his enemy's soul. This was not random prejudice. It was a business model. He paid them to remove people. He said, the words falling like ice. He paid them to clear the land, Eliza corrected softly. And he did not care how they did it, just like he does not care if a landslide buries your people. As long as he gets his dam. He uses the law when it suits him, and when it does not, he uses men like Kincaid, and all the while, he uses lies to turn good people into a mob. The fire of vengeance was still in Hashke's eyes, but now it was tempered, focused into a hard, sharp point. He looked from the town jail back to Eliza, and she could see the battle being waged within him. The path of the warrior, swift and bloody, or a different path, one of patience and cunning. Vengeance is a wildfire, he said at last, his voice steady again. It burns the guilty and the innocent. It burns the ground so nothing can grow again. He looked down at her hand, still on his arm, then met her eyes. This ledger, it is his own voice, his own hand.
Yes, she said.
A new determination settled over him, hardening his features into a mask of resolve. We will not give him the fight he wants. We will give him the one he fears. We will not use guns. We will use the truth. We will use his own words, his own numbers, to build a cage for him. He had made his choice. Not vengeance, but justice. In that moment, watching him deliberately master his own pain to choose a harder, more difficult path. Eliza knew she had been right to trust him. They were no longer two separate people fighting their own lonely battles. They were partners, bound by a shared secret and a shared purpose. The road ahead was still terrifyingly uncertain, but for the first time since arriving in Silver Vale, she did not feel entirely alone. The journey to Canyon de Chelly was a pilgrimage into silence. For 2 days, they rode eastward, leaving the scarred landscape of the silver mine behind and entering a vast, untouched wilderness of towering sandstone mesas and wind-scoured plains. Hashke spoke little, but taught Eliza through his actions. He showed her how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to find water seeping from a rock face, how to listen to the language of the hawks that circled high overhead. He was a different man out here. Lighter, his spirit unburdened by the oppressive weight of Silver Vale. The warrior's tension in his shoulders eased, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man in his own home. Canyon de Chelly was not a gash in the earth like the canyons near the mine. It was a cathedral carved by time and water. Its sheer red rock walls rose hundreds of feet from the canyon floor, where a ribbon of green marked the path of a small, life-giving river. Ancient cliff dwellings were tucked into the alcoves high above, the silent homes of a people who had lived in harmony with this place for 1,000 years. Hashke's grandmother lived in a simple hogan on the canyon floor, its circular shape echoing the natural forms around it. Sa'a was a woman who seemed as ancient and enduring as the canyon itself. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, and her eyes, dark and luminous, held a wisdom that felt bottomless. She greeted Eliza not as a stranger, but as a long-expected visitor, her hands, though gnarled with age, surprisingly soft and warm as she took Eliza's. She spoke in the melodic tones of the Dine language, with Hashke translating in a low, respectful voice. She listened intently as he recounted the events of the past weeks, his words painting a picture of the dam, the explosives, and the stolen boys. When he finished, Sa'a was silent for a long time, her gaze on the fire that crackled in the center of the hogan. Then she rose and beckoned them to follow. She led them not toward the river, but to a place where the towering canyon wall met the sandy floor. She stopped before a section of rock that looked no different from the rest, a sheer face of red sandstone. She placed her palm against it. "The white men see the river," she said, her voice a dry whisper like rustling leaves, which Hashke translated. "They think if they stop the river, they stop the life. They are fools. Their eyes see only the surface." She pressed her ear to the rock, a faint smile touching her lips. "Listen." Eliza, feeling a sense of profound reverence, did the same. She pressed her ear to the cold, solid stone. At first, she heard nothing but the pounding of her own heart. But then, as she quieted her mind, she heard it, a deep, resonant hum, a low, steady vibration from deep within the earth. It was the sound of a great power, immense and unseen. "It is the heart of the mother," Sa'a explained, her eyes glowing. "A river beneath the rock. It flows where no man can see it, where no dam can stop it. It feeds the secret springs. It is the true soul of this valley. To harm it is to harm everything, forever." She looked at Hashke, then at Eliza, her gaze piercing. "The dynamite you saw, the landslide he plans. It will not just block the surface water, it will crack the stone. It will poison the heart." Her hand found Eliza's. "You carry a weapon of paper and ink. He carries one of rock and fire. You must use yours to stop his." Her grip tightened. "But you must make a promise. Protect the life. Do not shed blood to save it. Blood spilled in anger only poisons the ground for the next generation." They made their promise under the watchful eyes of the ancient cliffs, a vow that felt more binding than any word spoken in a church or courtroom. The journey back to Silvervale was different. The weight had returned, but now it was a weight of purpose, not despair. Upon their return, Eliza's first stop was the mission. She found Padre Reuben tending the small, struggling vegetable garden behind the church. She gave him the copied ledger, its pages filled with her neat, careful script. "Padre," she said, her voice low, "this is a copy of a book. It contains dangerous truths. If anything should happen to me, you must see that it gets to a circuit judge, a federal marshal, anyone who is not on Silas Crow's payroll." The priest took the book, his wise eyes full of a sorrowful understanding. He did not ask what was in it. He simply nodded, his face grim. "I will guard it with my life." "Child," he said, "may God grant that it is never needed." That night, Eliza took the original ledger and, with her seamstress's shears, carefully cut a slit in the thick canvas lining of her best corset. She slid the slim volume inside, the book lying flat against her ribs. She stitched the seam closed with strong, invisible stitches. The corset, a garment designed to restrict and confine, had become her armor, the truth held literally close to her heart. She felt a measure of security, believing her preparations were complete. She was wrong. The battle was about to come to her. She was in her room, preparing for bed, when she heard the sound, a faint scraping from the hallway, followed by the soft click of a door being tried down the hall. She froze, her hand at her throat. It was late, well past the hour when the other boarders returned. A floorboard creaked just outside her own door. Someone was moving with a stealth that was deeply unsettling. Before she could cry out, the door to her room splintered near the lock and burst inward. Bo Kincaid filled the frame, a shadowy figure against the dim light of the hall.
He had a length of rope in one hand and a sickening smile on his face. "We missed our chance on the trail. Ma'am," he rasped. "My employer is a man who hates to leave a job unfinished." Eliza backed away, her mind racing, her eyes darting for a weapon, a path of escape. There was none. But just as Kincaid took a step into the room, a firm voice came from the hall. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" It was Martha Doyle. The landlady stood there in her nightgown, holding a heavy iron skillet like a club, her face a mask of righteous fury. Kincaid was momentarily startled. "Get back to your room, old woman. This is not your affair." "The hell it is not," Martha snapped. "This is my house, and you are not welcome in it. Get out before I split your head like a melon." For a moment, it seemed her sheer audacity might work. But Kincaid was a man for whom violence was a simple tool. With a snarl, he backhanded her across the face. The blow was brutal, the sound a sickening crack in the quiet hall. Martha cried out and crumpled to the floor, the skillet clattering uselessly beside her. The sight of the kind woman lying hurt on the floor broke through Eliza's fear, replacing it with a white-hot rage. She grabbed the heavy ceramic water pitcher from her washstand and hurled it at Kincaid's head. He ducked, and it shattered against the doorframe. But the diversion was enough. A hand shot out from the shadows of the stairwell, grabbing the back of Kincaid's collar and yanking him backward with incredible force. It was Hashke. He had been watching, waiting, an unseen guardian. He moved with a silent, lethal speed, slamming Kincaid against the opposite wall. The two men grappled, a desperate, grunting struggle in the narrow hallway. "Eliza, go," Hashke grunted, his arms locked with Kincaid's. The back stairs. Eliza did not hesitate. She knelt for a second beside Martha, saw that she was unconscious but breathing, then ran. She flew down the back stairs and out the kitchen door into the alley. Hashke was right behind her, his face grim. He had not defeated Kincaid, only disabled him long enough to escape. "This way," he commanded, pulling her along. They did not run down the main street. Instead, he led her to a place where the town seemed to end abruptly at a deep, stone-lined ditch. It was an old irrigation canal, long abandoned by the town but still known to him. "It runs beneath the town. It will take us to the river." He helped her down into the darkness. The air was cool and damp, smelling of mud and moss. They moved in a crouch, water seeping into their boots, their only light the faint starlight from the grates high above. It was a terrifying, claustrophobic journey, a flight through the town's hidden underbelly. They emerged minutes later on the bank of the small river, hidden by a thicket of willows. They were safe, for now. But their first thoughts were for Martha. They made their way to Padre Rubens' mission, a place they knew would be a sanctuary. The priest took them in without question, his face grim as they told him what had happened. Hashke immediately went back for Martha, carrying her through the darkened streets to the safety of the mission. They spent the rest of the night tending to the injured woman. Eliza gently cleaned the cut on Martha's cheek and applied a cool compress to the swelling, her hands gentle and sure. Hashke sat watch by the door, his stillness a comforting presence, in the shared, quiet work of caring for another. A new and deeper intimacy grew between them. They were more than allies now. They were partners, bound by shared danger and shared compassion. When Martha was resting as comfortably as possible, an idea sparked in Eliza's mind, an idea born from Saya's wisdom and the priest's quiet courage. "The town is afraid. Hashke," she said, "Crow is feeding their fear with lies and whiskey. We must give them something else." She went to the mission's pantry. With the blue corn flour the padre kept for the poor, she began to make dough. Hashke, understanding immediately, built up the fire in the small adobe oven. They worked together through the dawn, their hands touching as they shaped the small, round cakes. Later that morning, as the town was waking up to the fresh, ugly rumors that would surely follow the night's events, Eliza and Hashke did not hide.
They walked through the poorest quarter of Silver Vale, a place of lean-to shacks and hungry children, carrying a basket filled with warm blue corn cakes. They did not preach or make speeches. They simply gave the food away. To the miners' families whose credit had run out at the store. To the old prospectors too sick to work. At first, people were suspicious. But the warmth of the bread and the simple, undeniable kindness of the gesture began to break through. A woman with tired eyes accepted a cake and gave Eliza a small, grateful smile. A grizzled old man took one and nodded at Hashke, a flicker of respect in his gaze. It was a small act in the face of a great evil, like lighting a single candle in a hurricane. But it was a start. They were not just fighting Silas Crow's greed anymore. They were fighting his hatred. And they were fighting it not with weapons, but with the simple, powerful truth that a community is built not on fear and division, but on the sharing of a loaf of bread. They found refuge in a place of profound peace, a small, sheltered meadow on the edge of the valley that Hashke called his own. A simple canvas tent, barely large enough for two, was pitched beneath the sprawling branches of a juniper tree. He built a small, smokeless fire from dry cedar, its fragrant scent a clean and holy thing that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. The wind that moved through the high branches was not the angry, scouring Santa Ana of the desert hills, but a soft, sighing presence that spoke of ancient things. After the chaos of the attack and the frantic flight through the underbelly of Silver Vale, the silence here was a balm. Eliza sat on a thick wool blanket near the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup of herbal tea Hashke had brewed from plants she did not recognize. The day had been a blur of fear and action, of caring for Martha and distributing the corn cakes, of watching the faces of the townspeople shift from suspicion to a grudging respect. Now, in the stillness, exhaustion settled deep into her bones. Hashke sat across the fire from her, sharpening the blade of a small knife with a smooth river stone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was a steady, comforting sound. He worked with an economy of motion, his concentration absolute. He had said very little since they arrived, but his presence was a solid wall between her and the dangers they had left behind. He had taken care of her with a quiet, unobtrusive tenderness, ensuring she was warm, fed, and felt safe. It was this very tenderness, this gentle solicitude, that began to unravel a knot of fear deep inside her. It was a fear older than Silas Crow, a fear she had carried with her all the way from Kansas. She had seen men use kindness as a currency, a down payment on a debt of obligation they intended to collect later. She had seen how a man's care could become a cage, its bars forged from duty and gratitude until a woman forgot she was even a prisoner. She watched him now, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his cheekbones, the intense focus in his eyes. He had saved her life. More than once. He had trusted her with his people's secrets. They had become partners, their lives intertwined in a way she had never experienced. And a deep, powerful current of feeling was pulling her toward him, an undertow of want that was as terrifying as it was undeniable. She set her cup down, her hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" he asked, his work ceasing instantly. His perception was unnerving, as if he could feel the slightest shift in the emotional atmosphere between them. She drew her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, a gesture of self-protection. "When I was younger, back in Kansas," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "My father, he was not a well man. He had a temper that was like a summer storm, sudden and violent. But afterward, he would be so kind. He would bring me ribbons for my hair, or a piece of horehound candy, and he would say, 'You are my girl, Eliza Jane. You belong to me.'" She looked up from the fire and met Hashke's gaze. His eyes held a deep, patient stillness, encouraging her to continue. "I came to hate those ribbons," she confessed, a tremor in her voice. "I came to hate the sweetness of the candy, because they were not gifts. They were claims. They were a reminder that I was his property, that his kindness meant I owed him my silence, my obedience, I promised myself I would never belong to anyone like that again, that I would rather be entirely alone than be owned. She took a shaky breath. The secret fear finally given voice. I am so afraid of being owned. The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks into the darkness. Hashke set the knife and stone aside. He did not move closer, did not offer a comforting touch. He gave her the respect of space, of letting her words settle between them without being dismissed or explained away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but held the weight and certainty of the stone in his hand. Among my people, he said, we believe a person's spirit cannot be owned. It can be harmed. It can be caged. But it cannot be held in another's hand. It belongs only to the Creator, and to the path it must walk. He leaned forward slightly, his sincerity a tangible force. I keep my word. Eliza, you are free before you are anyone's. You are free before you are my friend, or my partner. You are free, even now. His words were not a simple reassurance. They were a statement of his deepest principles. He was offering her not a promise to be a gentle owner, but a solemn vow to honor her separateness, her very soul. He was giving her the one thing she had never been given before, the space to exist without obligation. A dam inside her broke, the dam she had so carefully constructed to hold back years of loneliness, of longing, of a deep, aching need to be seen and valued, not for her utility, but for herself. All the fear and caution she had lived by were washed away in a sudden, overwhelming flood of emotion, gratitude, relief, and a desire so powerful it stole her breath. The words came out on a raw, shaky whisper, a confession that was both a surrender and a declaration. I want you so bad. The silence that followed was charged, electric. The night seemed to be holding its breath. Hashke's dark eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not triumph or satisfaction, but a reflection of her own profound longing, a vulnerability he had kept hidden as carefully as she had kept hers. He rose then and moved around the fire with that same fluid grace she had first seen in the Agave Pass. He knelt before her on the blanket. He did not reach for her, did not pull her into an embrace. He simply waited, giving her every chance to retreat. When she did not move, when her eyes gave him the consent he had not yet asked for, he slowly, gently, reached for the collar of her blouse. His fingers were calloused from work and weather, but his touch was incredibly light as he undid the top button. Then the next. He pushed the fabric aside, exposing the smooth, pale skin of her shoulder to the cool night air. The contrast of the cold air and the warmth of the fire on her skin made her shiver. He did not kiss her. He did something far more intimate. He lifted his hand, and with the tip of his index finger, he began to draw a shape on her bare shoulder. The Navajo warrior's fingers answered, writing fire on her skin. It was not a fire of pain or destruction. It was a line of pure, concentrated heat, a spark that traced a path directly from her skin to the deepest part of her heart. It was a touch that spoke a language her body understood before her mind could catch up. A language of reverence, of adoration, of a connection that went beyond the physical. The slow, deliberate movement of his finger was a prayer, an oath, a brand of belonging that had nothing to do with ownership. It was a mark of being chosen. A soft sound escaped her lips, a sigh of wonder and release. The lines he drew were strange, angular, unfamiliar. "What are you writing?" she whispered, her voice thick. He finished the shape, his finger lingering for a moment, the warmth of his touch a permanent seal upon her skin. "It is a word from my language," he murmured, his voice low and close to her ear, his breath warm against her cheek. "A symbol. It means kin." He pulled back slightly so he could see her face. "It means house, home, but not a building of wood or stone. It is a place of balance, of safety. It is where you stand and know you are in the right place in the world. It is a home the spirit makes, not the hands." He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, unwavering tenderness. "It is a way of praying," he said softly, without need for words. He had answered her deepest fear not with a denial, but with a new definition. He was not claiming her. He was offering her sanctuary. He was building her a home, not of walls that would confine her, but of a commitment that would set her free. He had heard her confession of want, and answered with a promise of forever. And in the quiet of the high desert meadow, under the silent watch of the stars, Eliza Jane Whitlow finally, truly, felt safe. The news arrived with a runner in the dead of night, a young dine boy who had moved through the darkness like a ghost. He spoke in low, urgent tones to Hashke by the dying embers of their fire. Silas Crow was not waiting, spooked by the raid on his explosives cache and the growing unrest in town. He had pushed up the timeline. The test blast, the real blast, was set for sunrise. In a few short hours, the mountain would fall. The fragile peace of their meadow sanctuary shattered. The quiet intimacy of the night before felt like a lifetime ago, a dream from which they had been violently shaken awake. There was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. They had to act. "He is forcing our hand," Eliza said, her mind already working, clicking into the familiar, orderly patterns of a bookkeeper assessing a crisis. "He thinks a show of force will crush all opposition." "It will crush my people," Hashke countered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was already gathering their things, his movements economical and swift. "We cannot stop the main blast. There are too many guards now." "Then we do not stop it," Eliza said, a daring, two-fronted plan forming in her mind. "We redirect it, and we expose it. We cannot just save the valley, Hashke. We have to tear down the man who is trying to destroy it." He paused, looking at her in the dim starlight. "What are you thinking?" "You said there were secondary charges, meant to fracture the rock face and guide the landslide. What if they were gone?" she asked. "What if the blast had no direction? It would be a huge explosion. It would damage his dam works, but it might not bring the whole mountain down on your people." He considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. "It is possible, if we can get to the detonator lines that lead to the shear points. But it is a great risk." "The other risk is doing nothing," she countered. "But that is only half of it." She went to her satchel and pulled out the painstakingly copied ledger. "We need to get the law involved, but on our terms. Pike will not listen to us. But he is a rat, and a rat is most concerned with a sinking ship. We need to show him that Silas Crow's ship is going down." She carefully tore a single page from the back of the book, a page that detailed payments to Bo Kincaid for services rendered in the Verde Valley. "We will send him a message, an anonymous letter, telling him to investigate an illegal stockpile of explosives at the dam site, a stockpile large enough to threaten the whole town. And we will include this." She held up the page, just enough proof to make him think about saving his own skin instead of Crow's. A slow, grim smile touched Hashke's lips. "You build a better trap than any hunter I know, Eliza Jane." "You know the land," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "I know the ledgers. We will use both." They worked quickly. Eliza, using a piece of charcoal, wrote a short, blocky, anonymous note on a piece of scrap paper. It was a masterpiece of implication. Speaking of a disgruntled worker, a public danger, and a stockpile of dynamite far exceeding legal limits. She folded it with the ledger page inside. Hashke took the note. He would pass it to the son of a family they had given corn cakes to, a boy who could slip through the town unseen and leave it on the doorstep of the sheriff's office. That left the most dangerous part of the plan. They rode hard through the remaining darkness, the horses' hooves muffled on the soft desert ground. They approached the dam site from the high ridges, a place no guards would think to watch. Below them, the area was a hive of activity, lanterns bobbing in the dark as Crow's men made their final preparations. They left the horses and crept downward on foot, moving from shadow to shadow with a silence born of desperation. They reached the spot Hashke had identified, a place where a spider web of wires ran from the main cave to smaller drill holes along the cliff face. These were the secondary charges, the ones designed to shear the mountain away. The minutes that followed were the longest of Eliza's life. While she stood watch, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm in her ears, Hashke worked with his knife. His hands were sure and steady, his movements precise as he found each wire in the darkness and, with a quick, decisive cut, severed the connection. One by one, he disarmed the triggers that would have guided the avalanche. They were not just cutting wires, they were cutting the strings of a puppet master, leaving his creation to flail without direction. A shout from below told them a guard was approaching. They did not wait. They scrambled back up the ridge, their lungs burning, the sounds of pursuit beginning behind them. They reached the horses just as the eastern sky began to bleed with the first hint of gray. They galloped to a safe vantage point a mile away. Reining in their heaving horses behind an outcropping of rock, they turned to watch, their work done. The valley below was still cloaked in shadow, but the highest peaks were catching the first rays of the sun. It was a moment of impossible beauty, a serene prelude to an act of profound violence. A horn blared from the dam site, a single, mournful note that echoed through the canyons. Then came the silence, a deep, held breath that seemed to pull all the air from the world. The explosion was not a crack, but a deafening, rolling roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. A huge blossom of orange and black fire erupted from the cliff face, and a plume of dust and rock billowed thousands of feet into the air. Eliza felt the shock wave in her chest, a physical blow that made her horse shy and dance. The ground trembled beneath them. But the landslide, the terrible targeted avalanche they had feared, did not happen. The force of the blast went upward and outward, a chaotic, undirected eruption. A huge section of Crow's partially built dam crumbled and slid into the canyon, a cascade of broken timber and shattered rock. The cliff face above the Dine encampment, though scarred and smoking, held firm. They had done it. They had averted the massacre. A wave of dizzying relief washed over Eliza, so potent it almost buckled her knees. But as the roar of the blast subsided, it was replaced by a new sound. The sound of a man screaming her name, a scream of pure, unadulterated fury. Bo Kincaid. He was on horseback, charging up the ridge toward them, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He had seen them. He understood what they had done. Two of his riders were fanning out behind him, their rifles already drawn. "Ride," Hashke yelled, wheeling his horse. They plunged down the far side of the ridge into a dense forest of yucca, the plant's tall, flowering stalks and spiked leaves creating a treacherous, disorienting maze. The chase was a frantic, desperate thing. Bullets ripped through the thick yucca leaves around them, the sharp cracks of the rifles echoing in the enclosed space. They bent low over their horses' necks, weaving through the spiky plants, the sharp leaves tearing at their clothes and skin. They burst out of the yucca field onto a rocky plateau. Kincaid, his horse faster, was closing the distance. He spurred his mount. Pulling alongside Hashke, he launched himself from his saddle, tackling Hashke and sending them both tumbling to the hard, dusty ground. Eliza screamed, pulling her mare to a skidding halt. The other two riders were coming for her. One of them uncoiled a lariat, his intention clear. The fight between Hashke and Kincaid was brutal and raw. Kincaid was a brawler, all brute strength and wild, swinging fists. Hashke was faster, a blur of controlled motion, using Kincaid's momentum against him. They rolled in the dust, a tangle of limbs and fury, the sounds of their struggle punctuated by grunts and the sickening thud of fists on flesh. The rider with the rope was getting closer. Eliza fumbled in her saddlebag for the small pistol Hashke had insisted she carry. Her hands were shaking too much to get a clear aim. The lariat snaked through the air, its loop settling not over her, but over the horn of her saddle. The rider pulled his horse back, and the rope snapped taut, nearly yanking the mare off its feet. Eliza was trapped, anchored to her pursuer. She saw him draw his pistol, a smug look of triumph on his face. In that split second, her mind went cold and clear. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Her hand instinctively went to her ribs, to the corset that held the ledger. It was a garment of restriction, of secrets, but her seamstress's mind knew it was also a repository of tools. Tucked into a small, hidden pocket within the canvas lining was a sturdy, sharp steel pin she used for making adjustments. She pulled it free, her fingers, nimble from a lifetime of stitching, flew to the thick, knotted rope on her saddle horn. She did not try to untie it. She jammed the point of the pin deep into the tightly woven fibers, twisting and prying, forcing a small opening in the knot. She worked with a frantic, focused intensity, the rider now taking aim. She shoved the pin in again, levering the knot with all her strength. It loosened. With a final, desperate tug, she pulled the rope free just as a bullet sang past her head. She did not wait. She looked back at the fight. Kincaid had Hushke on the ground, his big hands closing around Hushke's throat. There was no time for a perfect shot. Eliza raised her pistol, aimed for the ground beside Kincaid's head, and fired. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt and rock chips, stinging Kincaid's face. He roared in surprise and pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Hushke needed. He twisted his body, throwing Kincaid off balance, and reversed their positions, his knife suddenly appearing in his hand, its tip pressed against Kincaid's throat. It was over. The other two riders, seeing their leader captured, hesitated, their rifles uncertain. And into that tense, frozen tableau rode Sheriff Amos Pike. He crested the hill with two deputies, his face a mixture of confusion and alarm. He took in the scene, the two riders with their guns drawn, Eliza, breathing hard, a pistol in her hand and a loosened rope on her saddle, and Hushke, holding a knife to the throat of Silas Crow's chief enforcer. His eyes then traveled past them, to the pillar of smoke still rising from the disastrous explosion at the dam site. He clutched a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. The anonymous note? He looked from the note to the scene before him, and then his gaze followed the tracks in the dust. Tracks that led directly back to the very cave the note had mentioned, the cave where an illegal, catastrophic amount of dynamite had been stored. Every pretense, every lie, every carefully constructed deception fell away. He was not looking at a Navajo agitator and a troublemaking seamstress. He was looking at the living, breathing, undeniable proof of a massive criminal conspiracy, a conspiracy he had been paid to ignore. He saw Bo Kincaid, not as a victim, but as a perpetrator caught in the act. He saw the ledger page in his hand, a down payment on a truth he could no longer afford to deny. The ship was not just sinking, it was on fire, and Sheriff Amos Pike knew, with the cold, hard certainty of a cornered animal, that he had to jump. The circuit judge arrived in Silvervale like a storm front, his presence preceded by a reputation for iron will and incorruptible justice. His name was Alistair Blackwood, a tall, gaunt man with a severe black coat and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He did not ask for a courtroom. He commandeered the largest building in town, the Grand Hotel Saloon. The gambling tables were pushed to the walls, and a jury box was hastily constructed from empty freight crates. The air, thick with the lingering ghosts of stale beer and desperation, was now charged with the electric tension of a reckoning. The town itself was a physical map of its own division. On one side of the makeshift aisle sat the supporters of Silas Crow, miners and merchants who had hitched their fortunes to his star, their faces a mixture of belligerence and anxiety. On the other side sat a smaller, quieter group, Padre Reuben, a recovered but still bruised Martha Doyle, Mr. Prosper looking terrified but resolute, and a handful of the families to whom Eliza and Hushke had given bread. It was a meager showing, but it was a start. Silas Crow sat at a heavy oak table, looking every bit the town benefactor, his face a mask of wronged innocence. Beside him was his lawyer, a man named Abernathy, imported from the East. Abernathy was slick and polished, his tailored suit an insult to the dusty reality of the town. He dripped condescension. When Judge Blackwood slammed his gavel, The sound was not like wood on wood, but like a rock striking a coffin. The proceedings began. Abernathy rose, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. He told the jury a story. It was a story of progress and prosperity, of a visionary, Silas Crow, who sought only to bring life-giving water and wealth to this struggling community. He then painted a different picture, a dark and savage one, of a renegade Navajo, Hashke Yazi, who led a band of violent saboteurs. He described Eliza as a woman of questionable character, an outsider who had poisoned the well of community trust, manipulating the native man to her own twisted ends. He called the explosion at the dam site an act of terror, a declaration of war against the good, hard-working people of Silver Vale. The words were vile, but they were skillful, playing on every prejudice and fear that festered in the room. Some of the jurors, simple men who understood rock and silver better than law, nodded along. The first witness against Crow was Padre Reuben. The small priest took the stand, his presence a pool of calm in the turbulent room. He held the copied ledger in his hands when he presented it as evidence. Abernathy was on his feet in an instant, shouting objections, calling it a forgery, hearsay, a fabrication of a desperate woman and a meddling cleric. Judge Blackwood silenced him with a cold stare. The judge announced that the book would be entered into the record, its authenticity to be determined by corroborating testimony. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. The law in this town was not, it seemed, going to be a simple affair. Martha Doyle was next. She walked to the stand with a slight limp, the purple and yellow bruise around her eye a silent, damning testimony of its own. She did not waver. She looked directly at Bo Kincaid, who sat behind Crow, and identified him as the man who had broken into her home, who had attacked her when she tried to protect Eliza. Abernathy tried to dismantle her. He asked if perhaps she had been drinking. He suggested she was a lonely woman who had invented a story for attention. Martha looked him dead in the eye. She said she had run a boarding house for 20 years and she knew the difference between a drunk and a predator. The jury looked at her bruised face, and they believed her. Then Hashke was called. He walked to the stand not with the defiance of a warrior, but with the quiet dignity of a man who stood on his own ground. He did not speak of rights or treaties. He spoke of life. He unrolled the pages from the sketchbook of Eliza, the precise charcoal drawings of the faulty blasting caps. He explained, in simple, direct terms, how the wires were set not for a controlled blast, but for a catastrophic failure. He described how the landslide would have moved, where it would have fallen. Then he unrolled a large piece of tanned deer hide. On it, drawn with charcoal and berry juice, was a map. It was a map of Coyote Wash, but it showed more than the surface river. It showed the deep, hidden veins of water flowing beneath the rock, the secret heart of the valley. He explained that this was the life Sa'a had shown them, the true soul of the land. He told the court that the plan of Silas Crow was not merely to steal a river, but to murder the land itself for a generation. Abernathy laughed, a short, sharp bark of ridicule. He called it savage superstition, the fanciful drawings of an uneducated man. He asked the jury if they were going to base their future on ghost stories and fairy tales about rivers that ran through solid rock. During the midday recess, Eliza saw it. One of the lieutenants of Crow moved among the jurors, his hand patting a man on the back, his head bent low in quiet conversation, a coin discreetly passing from one palm to another. It was a sickeningly casual act of corruption. The evidence, as powerful as it was, might not be enough to overcome a bribed jury. She looked at Hashke, and he met her gaze with a grim understanding. The truth needed a final, undeniable push. It had to come from her. When court resumed, Eliza was called to the stand. Abernathy circled her like a coyote, his questions designed to paint her as unstable, a woman scorned, perhaps by a business dealing gone wrong with Mr. Crow in Dodge City. He tried to twist her flight to Silver Vale into an admission of guilt.
her association with Hashki into a scandalous betrayal of her own kind. Eliza answered his questions calmly, her voice steady. But when he was finished, she did not step down. She turned to Judge Blackwood. She announced that she was not merely a witness. She was the official complainant in this matter. She told the court that the copy held by Padre Rubin was an exact replica of an original document she had in her possession. Then, in the stunned silence of the courtroom, she reached behind her back and unlaced her corset. The garment, with its stiff bones and confining structure, had been her armor and her secret keeper. She pulled it from beneath her dress. The act was intimate and defiant, a public shedding of secrets. From the slit in the canvas lining, she pulled the original cloth-bound ledger. The book felt heavy in her hands, a weight of ink and death. She did not open it to the pages detailing the dynamite shipments. She opened it to a page from 2 years prior. Her voice did not tremble as she read the entry aloud. The date, the amount, $5,000. The recipient, the Crow's Foot Riders. The purpose, listed in the cold, clear script of a clerk who had simply been doing his job, land clearing services. She lowered the book and looked at the jury, at the pale, shocked face of Silas Crow. She told them about the Verde River. She told them about the Yavapai encampment that had been there 1 week and gone the next. She told them how the land had been cleared, not with axes but with guns, and how the cattle of Silas Crow now grazed on the ghosts of a people he had erased for profit. A great, collective gasp went through the saloon. This was no longer about a dam. This was about a massacre. The accusations of sabotage and native savagery now seemed like a grotesque mockery. The truth had landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Judge Blackwood, his face a granite mask, made his decision. He called his next witness, Sheriff Amos Pike. The sheriff walked to the stand, each step a heavy, reluctant journey. He was sweating, his pale face slick with it. He looked once at Silas Crow, and the look he received in return was one of pure, reptilian menace. Then he looked at the unyielding face of the judge, at the ledger sitting on the table, at the stunned faces of the jury. He was a man standing on the deck of a burning, sinking ship, and the last lifeboat was about to pull away. His testimony began as a series of evasions and half-remembered truths. Judge Blackwood cut through the fog with a sharp, pointed question about Crow's finances. Pike began to stammer. The judge pressed him, asking about the payments Pike himself had received, payments to ensure his deputies were always looking the other way. That was when the dam inside Amos Pike finally broke. The torrent of words that came out was not a confession. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to save himself. He admitted everything. He told the court how Crow had paid him a monthly retainer. He described the orders to intimidate Eliza upon her arrival. He confessed that Crow had explicitly ordered him to arrest the 3 young Dine boys on false pretenses, to create an incident that would turn the town against the Navajo and justify a violent response. He laid bare the entire rotten structure of the enterprise of Silas Crow, throwing his former benefactor into the flames to escape the heat. The saloon erupted. Men were on their feet, shouting, their allegiances shattering and reforming in a chaotic instant. Judge Blackwood hammered his gavel again and again, its sharp, cracking reports finally bringing a semblance of order. His voice cut through the remaining din, cold and final as a winter grave. He ordered Silas Crow and Bo Kincaid taken into federal custody to be held for trial on charges of conspiracy, murder, and inciting a riot. As deputies snapped iron handcuffs onto the wrists of the 2 men, the truth finally settled over the room. It had not come easily. It had been hidden in rock, sewn into clothing, and guarded in the hearts of a few brave people. But like the secret river beneath the canyon, it had finally found its way to the surface, a force too powerful to be damned. The justice of Judge Blackwood was a hammer, but the walls of the Silvervale jail were old wood and complacency. The town was still reeling, a chaotic mix of shock and dawning belief, when Silas Crow and Bo Kincaid made their final, violent move. It was not a subtle escape. 2 deputies,
their loyalty still bound by the silver that lined their pockets, created a diversion. In the ensuing confusion, Crow and Kincaid were gone, melting into the warren of back alleys and shadowed passages that had long been their domain. They did not simply flee. A man like Silas Crow did not accept defeat. If he could not own the town, he would see it burn. Their target was the mercantile warehouse down by the rail spur, a massive tinderbox filled with grain, lamp oil, lumber, and all the dry, flammable goods that sustained the community. It was the heart of the town's commerce, and they set it to the torch with a cold, vengeful fury. The first sign of their parting gift was not the sight of flames, but the smell. A thick, acrid smoke began to drift over the town, followed by a strange, dark snow. Black ash, light and malevolent, began to rain down from the sky, coating the boardwalks, dusting the hats of the stunned townspeople. A funereal confetti that settled on every surface. It was the physical manifestation of the corruption that had poisoned them, now made visible, falling from the heavens. The volunteer fire brigade, a disorganized but willing group of men, rushed to the scene with their hand pumper and buckets. At first, the blaze seemed contained, a singular catastrophe that could be fought. But then, a new enemy joined the fight. The wind, which had been still all afternoon, began to stir. It was the hot, dry breath of the desert, and it shifted direction, gusting not away from the town, but directly toward it. The fire, which had been a pillar, became a wave. Sparks and burning embers, lifted on the wind, sailed through the air like deadly messengers. They flew over the rooftops of the main street, over the false fronts and the respectable businesses, and began to fall upon the most vulnerable part of Silver Vale. They rained down on the poor quarter, a collection of hastily built shacks, dry as bone, where the families of the lowest-paid miners lived. Panic erupted. A single fire had become a dozen, small blazes catching on tar paper roofs and in piles of dry brush. The volunteer brigade was overwhelmed, its efforts now a futile gesture against a rapidly spreading inferno. It was then that a new force appeared. From the edge of town, where the desert met the last shabby structures, came Hashke. He was not alone. Behind him were 24 Dine men, drawn from the valley by the pillar of smoke, their face grim and determined. They carried not rifles, but shovels and axes. For a tense moment, the two groups, the townspeople and the Navajo, faced each other across a gulf of fear and mistrust. The very men who had been the town's boogeymen were now its only hope. A miner, his face black with soot, shouted that they should go back, that this was not their fight. Hashke walked forward until he stood before the man. He did not speak of treaties or of justice. He pointed with his shovel toward the shacks where mothers were frantically pulling their children into the street. He said that the fire did not care whose home it burned. It was a simple, undeniable truth. Padre Reuben, his face smudged with ash, stepped between the groups. He called for shovels, for axes, for any man with strength in his arms. He said that today. There were no sides. There was only the fire and those who would stand against it. The spell of hatred, so carefully woven by Silas Crow, finally broke. The miner who had shouted now looked at his own small shack. Directly in the path of the flames, he spat on his hands, gripped his shovel, and nodded at Hashke. The work began. They dug with a desperate fury. A line of men, white and Navajo, their shoulders straining together, their shovels biting into the hard, dry earth. They were cutting a fire break, a wide, raw trench to starve the approaching flames of their fuel. The sounds of splintering wood and the roar of the fire were punctuated by the rhythmic scrape and thud of their tools. Sweat and ash mingled on their faces, carving pale channels through the grime. They were no longer enemies. They were simply men, fighting a common foe. While the men battled the main front of the fire, Eliza's attention was drawn to a smaller, more immediate horror. A stable on the edge of the threatened area had caught fire, its old, dry timbers going up like a torch.
The terrified screams of the horses inside were a sound of pure agony. People were trying to get them out, but the animals, mad with fear, were unmanageable. Then a woman shrieked, a sound of piercing maternal terror. She screamed a name. A little boy, no older than 5, had been playing in the hayloft. In the chaos, he had been forgotten. He was trapped. Without a second thought, Eliza ran. She grabbed a wet burlap sack from a water barrel and threw it over her head, plunging into the choking black smoke that billowed from the stable doors. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that seared her lungs. Inside was a vision of hell. Flames licked up the walls, and a terrified horse, its eyes wide and white, kicked violently at its stall. She could hear the boy crying somewhere above. She scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, the rungs hot to the touch. The loft was an inferno of smoke, the air so thick she could not see. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling, shouting the boy's name. A small, terrified whimper answered her. She found him huddled in a corner, his small body shaking, his face streaked with tears and soot. She wrapped the wet burlap around him, shielding him as best she could. She told him to hold on tight, her voice a strange, calm whisper in the roaring chaos. As she turned to go back to the ladder, a flaming beam crashed down from the roof, blocking their path. They were trapped. She looked around wildly. There was a large opening at the back of the loft, a door for loading hay, its ledge a terrifying 12 feet above the hard ground of the corral behind the stable. It was their only chance. She dragged the boy to the opening. Below, Hashke, who had seen her run into the burning building, was looking up, his face a mask of desperation. She lowered the boy into his waiting arms. He was safe. But as she prepared to jump herself, a new figure appeared at the edge of the corral, a specter emerging from the smoke. It was Bo Kincaid, his face a twisted mask of hate, a pistol in his hand. He had not fled. He had stayed for one last piece of business. He raised the pistol, his target not Eliza, but Hashke, who was still holding the child, his back exposed. Time seemed to slow. Eliza saw the deliberate aim, the cold intent in the eyes of Kincaid. She saw Hashke, vulnerable, shielding the boy with his own body. There was no time to shout a warning. There was only time to act. She did not think about the fall. She did not think about the flames. She launched herself from the loft, her body twisting in the air, a desperate, instinctive movement to place herself between the gun and the man she loved. The world exploded in a searing flash of pain. The bullet, meant for the heart of Hashke, tore through the fleshy part of her left shoulder. The impact spun her around, and she landed hard in the dirt. The world dissolving into a gray, roaring tunnel. A distant part of her mind registered the familiar, sickening trauma of a gunshot wound. A dark ghost from a past she had never spoken of, now made horribly real. The shot broke the spell of the fire. Kincaid, his face contorted with rage at his miss, started to aim again, but Hashke was no longer a stationary target. He gently set the child down and moved with a speed that was not human. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his body a blur of purpose. Kincaid fired again, wildly, the bullet going high. Hashke's hand clamped down on the gun, his other hand delivering a single, precise blow to the side of the head of Kincaid. The larger man staggered, his eyes glazing over. The gun clattered to the ground. Hashke had him, disarmed and helpless. For a long moment, Hashke stood over the dazed man, his chest heaving, his face a terrible battleground of emotions. In his eyes was the memory of a boy named Adi, the image of the young men in handcuffs, the feel of the land being poisoned. The desire for vengeance was a living thing in him, a screaming demand for a final, bloody justice. His knife was in his hand, its blade hungry for a life. Kincaid looked up at him, a flicker of fear finally breaking through his brutish confidence. He saw his death in the eyes of the Navajo warrior. But then Hashke looked past him, at Eliza, who was pushing herself up, her face pale,
Her hand clamped to her bleeding shoulder. He saw the child, safe and crying, being scooped up by his mother. He saw the line of men, white and dying, still digging, their common effort a testament to a different kind of future. He heard the voice of Sa'a, a whisper in his memory, telling him not to poison the ground with blood. The fire in his eyes did not die, but it changed. The wild, destructive heat of vengeance cooled into the hard-tempered steel of justice. He lowered the knife. He did not kill Bo Kincaid. He took the lariat from the saddle of a nearby horse and, with a series of swift, expert knots, bound the hands and feet of his enemy. He would hand him over to the law, a living symbol that the cycle of violence could be broken, that the law, however flawed, was a better weapon than the knife. As the sun began to set, casting long, smoky shadows across the exhausted town, a rider came galloping down the main street. He brought news from the next town over. Silas Crow had been apprehended. He had been found in the telegraph office, trying to send a wire to the territorial governor. He was trying to spin one last lie, a desperate story blaming the fire on a coordinated native uprising. His final act was not one of violence, but one of cowardly deception, and it had failed. The price had been paid, and the bill had finally come due. The months that followed the fire were a season of slow, difficult healing. The black rain of ash had stopped, but its memory lingered, a dark stain on the soul of Silver Vale. The town, however, was not the same. The fire that had threatened to destroy it had also cauterized a deep wound, burning away the worst of the poison that Silas Crow had spread. In the shared work of rebuilding the burned shacks and clearing the debris, something new and fragile began to grow. The verdict from the federal court in Tucson was a distant echo of a battle already won. Silas Crow was found guilty on all counts, his web of corruption and violence laid bare for the world to see. His name, once spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence, now became a curse, a cautionary tale whispered to newcomers. The great dam, his monument to greed, stood as a broken testament to his folly, a scar on the landscape that would take generations to fade. But the water, the true life of the land, began to return, with the threat of the dam gone. Coyote Wash was preserved. In an unprecedented act of cooperation, a new water commission was formed. The first meeting was a stiff, awkward affair, held in the half-rebuilt saloon. On one side of the table sat grizzled miners, their faces still etched with suspicion. On the other sat elders from the dine, their expressions impassive, watchful. Padre Reuben and a surprisingly resolute Mr. Prosper sat between them. Hashka stood quietly at the back, a guardian ensuring the peace. It was a miner, a man who had lost his own home in the fire, who broke the silence. He pulled a pouch of tobacco from his pocket and offered it to one of the elders, a simple, profound gesture of respect. A conversation began, not about rights and grievances, but about rainfall and grazing lands and the shared, desperate need for the life-giving water. A bridge was being built, one difficult word at a time. Life in Silver Vale began to find a new rhythm. The evenings, once dominated by the raucous noise of the saloons, now had a new sound. From the open doors of Prosper's dry goods, where the shelves had been pushed back to make room, came the quiet scratching of pencils on slate. Eliza had started a night class. She taught the miners, men who could break rock with their hands but could not sign their own names, how to read and write. She taught their wives how to keep household accounts, giving them a power and independence they had never known. She stood at the front of the room, her left shoulder still tender from the bullet wound, and found a new purpose. She was no longer just a bookkeeper of secrets, but a sharer of knowledge, her skills a tool for building up, not for tearing down. A new fund, jointly administered by Padre Reuben and Saya, was established to protect the watershed, a formal recognition of the sacred promise made in the heart of the canyon. The town was learning, slowly and painfully, that its survival depended not on walls that divided, but on hands that joined together. Eliza and Hashke did not stay in the town itself. With the help of some of the men from the fire break,
They built a small, sturdy cabin on the edge of the valley, in the meadow where they had once found sanctuary. It was a simple structure of pine and river stone, with a wide porch that looked out toward the distant, majestic cliffs of Canyon de Chelly. It was a house, but for Eliza, it was the first true home she had ever known. One evening, as a cool autumn breeze whispered through the pinon pines, they sat on that porch. The sky was a deep, impossible indigo, littered with a careless spill of brilliant stars. The moon was a silver sickle, hanging low in the west. The air was clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth, the last vestiges of the fire's taint finally washed away by the seasonal rains. Hashke had been working on something for days, a small piece of juniper wood held carefully in his hands. Now, he was finished. He handed it to Eliza. It was smooth and warm to the touch, the wood's grain a beautiful swirl of purple and cream. Carved into its surface was a single, elegant symbol, a design of interlocking lines and circles that seemed to hold a perfect, peaceful balance. "I know this," Eliza said softly, tracing the lines with her finger. "It is what you wrote on my skin." "It is Hozo," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to blend with the sounds of the night. "It is more than a word. It is the path we walk. It means beauty, but not just the kind you see with your eyes. It is the beauty of a horse running free, of a healthy child, of a story told well. It is order and harmony. It is the world in balance, the way it was meant to be. It is what we have been fighting for. It is what we have found." She looked from the carving to his face, her heart full of a quiet, steady joy that was so much deeper and more enduring than simple happiness. He had given her a home, not of wood and stone, but of balance and safety. He had given her Hozo. Their life together was not one of promises of forever, but of a quiet, daily commitment. They did not speak of belonging to each other. They simply chose each other, every sunrise, every sunset. His past was a landscape of loss she respected but did not try to heal. Her own past, the shadows of a harsh father and the desperate flight from Kansas, had finally begun to recede, its power to harm her dissolving in the gentle strength of his acceptance. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her wounded one, which was now only a dull ache, a reminder not of pain, but of sacrifice and survival. The night breeze touched her bare arms, raising goosebumps. She smiled, a slow, mischievous curve of her lips. She turned her head, her breath warm against his ear, and whispered the words that had once been a raw confession of desperate need. But now, they were a playful, confident, joyful declaration of a woman who was loved, and who was, above all, free. "I want you so bad." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. He did not answer with words. He gently took her hand and turned it palm up. Then, with the tip of his finger, as he had done once before by the fire, he began to write on the sensitive skin of her wrist. The lines of heat were no longer a startling revelation, but a familiar, beloved language, a promise of a home that could never be taken from her. The Navajo warrior's fingers answered, his touch as soft and reverent as a prayer. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.